Hey there, my name is Alan. I've had the good fortune of being born and raised in Florida. America's wing has a lot of weird and flexible laws, and I was able to forge a lucrative career as a swordsman because of them. I get asked a lot of questions, so I'll cover the big ones here so there's no confusion down the line. The open carry law down here in Florida allows one to carry a bladed weapon as long as it's sheathed and visible, meaning that the size of the blade is irrelevant. And because of this, I am able to walk down the street with a pair of long swords strapped to my back, as long as I'm avoiding obvious things like a school or a hospital. You'll notice by the things that I do and the equipment I carry that I am, in essence, a witcher. To the uninformed, a witcher is a monster hunter from the books of Andrzej Sapkowski and the video games by CD Projekt Red. I do go by this job description, but more often than not I simply say that I am a swordsman. I carry a steel sword, and a specially designed silver sword and custom-made sheaths on my back. The sheaths have a cutout along the side that allows me to draw the blade quickly and easily, and replace it just the same. Carrying the swords on my back was easier, since the combat style I developed involves a lot of footwork, which is impossible with a scabbard noisily slapping on my leg. I worked for a flat fee, and I had my clients sign a contract that would remove any liability from them and ensure complete discretion until the job was done. And this meant that any wounds I would sustain are my problem, and if I get eaten out in the woods, my client is not responsible. I took on a variety of common and, at times, supernatural work. This meant I would be hired to find missing people, and at the same time would be asked to break the curse. Living in Florida, weird things do happen, and the authorities aren't always going to believe the first call someone gets about ghosts and gribbles waiting in the woods. That's where I come in. For the right price, nothing is too crazy. No explanation is too extreme. I'm trying to keep it chronological. My first contract was nothing overly supernatural in hindsight, but even now it makes my skin crawl. This was shortly after I posted my first flyers around town, and I was called in by a woman that believed she was possessed. I was nervous about walking around looking fresh out of Comic-Con, so I didn't exactly match the description my flyers had. The woman invited me in and explained that she was constantly waking up with these sores all over her body, and she couldn't ever sleep a full night without convulsing into fits and waking up every few minutes. It was as if her muscles would lock up and twist into themselves. Her doctor had no idea what possibly could be going on, and her conservative family begged her to allow a priest into her home, and her work life had begun to decline due to so many sick days. I investigated around her home, checking anything that could be out of the ordinary. It was a newer building and, as such, the classic leaky pipes that drive people crazy explanation was out of the question. It wasn't until I had a hunch to flip her mattress over that I found out exactly what was going on. As soon as the underside of the mattress hit the light of day, millions of blood-gorged bedbugs had begun to pour out of the seams, desperately searching for a dark place to hide. After recoiling in disgust and taking a few pictures before the parasites could shelter themselves again, I had to deduce that the woman was having a little more than a terrible allergic reaction to the bites of the creatures. And sure enough, after the woman had spoken to some specialists, it was just so. Her body reacted differently to the saliva of the insects. And that's why the sores looked unidentifiable and her muscles would contract so wildly. And this one always bothers me. I moved around with some basic work after that. As I was just starting out, I didn't really have any experience with certain things, but I did have a lot of landscaping experience. Beating things with the sword wasn't going to become overly lucrative until many months later. I was asked to clear a path in a several-acre forested area located behind a new housing complex. The owners wanted to advertise luxury hiking grounds, or something equally pretentious, and figured that hiring me for a one-time flat-rate fee was much cheaper than paying a landscaper to do it by the hour. I cleared through nearly a mile of foliage with a large bush machete, my mind on autopilot, and was deep enough in the woods at this point that I couldn't hear any signs of the city nearby. It was at this point that I began to feel a peculiar kind of hunger. This craving grew fast, and it wasn't just a could go for a sandwich type of hunger, but something ancient, something primal. I felt that my life was in danger unless I ate something, right then and there. This hunger hung over me like a cloud, and I could not focus on anything else. After what felt like an eternity, I was able to rest free of this unaccountable peckishness, just in time to find that I was in front of a chain-link fence, brandishing my machete, not 10 feet away from a terrified little girl. Her mother was rushing to her side, screaming colorful Floridian language as she shielded her daughter, threatening to call the police and demanding to know what I was doing. I made some quick excuses about landscaping, apologized for the scare, and I cheesed it before I had to figure out how many tasers it would take to put me down. The rest of the contract was uneventful, and I finished clearing the path without incident. But that hunger was always on my mind any time I went into the woods after that. It wouldn't be until a few months later that I would figure out why I felt it. I began to branch out after this contract. I moved past my tiny little city and I started moving around, and despite my awful little Ford barely being able to move 20 miles without something exploding. I even began to enlist Craigslist as a way to find new work, and that's when I read about the alligator. We have a lot of gators down here in Florida, and they're usually peaceful beasts, more afraid of us than we are of them, but they are still predators, and some of them get to be unusual sizes. Some of them found it easier to attack the common swimmer than wait days upon days by the river, hoping a deer would come close. One particular river monster was this fat dinosaur that grew to be a good solid ton in weight, and could easily wreck a small building with an errant swing of its mighty tail. This beast had killed no less than a dozen men, women and children at a secluded spring, and had no problem killing the locals that had gone after it in vengeance, including a park ranger and a police officer. After it had left no trace of an outraged father, promising to come back with the monster's head, they finally ran out of options and they hired me. I offered my services, and because nobody knew me in that little town, nobody hesitated to accept my price. The local ranger station even made a bet that I wouldn't come back alive. My plan for taking the thing down was to spruce up a paddleboard, camouflaging it with weeds and wood, making it look like a ball of junk heading downriver. I armed myself with a particular weapon called a bang stick, which is essentially just a 12-gauge shell on the end of a steel pole. I learned from the mistakes of those that came before me. Hunting this beast would mean thinking like prey, hoping to catch the beast napping or otherwise indisposed. Hunting it like a predator would put me against a creature that's been killing its entire life, and was frankly much better at it. I spent 12 hours on that goddamn raft, and my patience was rewarded with a sleeping gator, and a nice new hole in his face. I mentioned before that I took on any sort of contract, any that involved missing persons. Despite how flat my state is, we have a lot of wooded areas, and some of them stretch on for miles without being considered national parks. Usually these are the spots of uninvited wilderness on the side of the major highways. And this is one of the saddest things I've had to investigate. I received a call from a father claiming that his son had gone missing. He had called the authorities, but they had found no trace of him in the massive woodlands they called a backyard. I wasn't exactly surprised. Police down here are just lazy. They would prefer to leave a case cold rather than get the dogs out. When I had arrived, the man had begun as soft-spoken and calm as he was on the phone, but as I raked more details out of him, was he wearing anything specific? Why did he run away? Did he have someone he could go to? Then he snapped. He broke down and told me that he had an argument with his son over something irrelevant, and he had run off into the forest hoping he would die out there. The man begged to find his son. I didn't pull out any more information than I needed from the poor man, and I had set out to find his boy. His trail hadn't gone cold yet, and I could understand why the cops couldn't quite pick it up. They were very subtle things, like broken branches and damp leaves among dry ones. I trailed the boy until I came to a cutoff on the path where there was a scattering of wet, slippery leaves that had led down a steep ravine. Sliding down to get a closer look, I found out exactly what had happened to the kid. Let me tell you about the coyotes down here. They're very cowardly animals, often choosing to flee rather than fight. But that all changes once you step into their dens. Here they fight as ferocious as wolves. They had torn the boy apart. All I found was his lower half and attractive as intestine. I could tell by the shoes. I had to report my findings to the father. I didn't charge him for the work. I couldn't. This was several months in, and I was finally becoming comfortable walking around looking like a great value Garo over Via. I'll deviate here to explain the types of swords that I used. My steel sword was a simple, battle-ready German sword that I got off Amazon, and my silver sword was custom-made. I had a lot of disposable income before I started this career. The sword itself is a cheap steel sword blank-coated in a layer of silver, with parts taken from other swords to construct the hilt. I needed both to do this work. I once found myself in a local campground. I was asked to investigate some reports that campers had been putting in by owners of the park. There were strange lights in the evening fog, markings on the trees around campsites, and the ever-present stink of rotting blood. This was the first time I had been fully equipped for a job, and this was the first time I had no true idea about what I was getting myself into. I investigated around the last campsite that had sent in a report, scantly a day ago, and I found that I did, indeed, have strange markings on all the trees around it. And they looked like a mountain lion had scored around the trees, inclined for purchase, as if swinging from the base to base like a monkey. I had taken my phone out at this point to take a picture, when I had the urge to stuff my nose into my shirt due to the sudden, sour stink of blood in the air. Not knowing what else to do, I drew the German bastard sword from my back and I took a high stance, looking around frantically to figure out what was happening. It was only then that I realized there was no natural sound. The wind blew, the leaves shifted, but the crickets and cicadas had all stopped. I felt the blood in my veins with every thunderous pump of my heart. In an instant, I was lying on my stomach, wind knocked clear out of me. Struggling to my feet and trying to catch my breath, I planted myself back first against a tree, blade ever at the ready. But at this point, that stink of blood had long gone. I found out that whatever had struck me seemed to have been aiming at my spine. And if it weren't for the steel-reinforced wooden sword scabbers that I had been wearing, it could have hurt me a lot worse than it did. I noped out of there for the time being. And that's all I have for now. To avoid this post being coming to a wall of text, I'll write more later, and I hope to explain why I felt that excruciating hunger in the woods during my path clearing in my next post. Florida is a very weird state, but don't ever get too comfortable down here. When the sun sets on this land, something dark rises, and not everybody is ready to deal with the things in the shadows on their own. Hey everybody, it's Al again. I'm back with a few more stories. I've been doing this for a long time, so I try to keep coming back with more. And doing this for as long as I have, it began to amass a multitude of scars. I was foolish and young enough to believe that I could just avoid any claw, knife, or tooth heading my way. But I quickly found out that was a fantasy. Especially when you refuse to fight any other range than fart-smelling clothes. I wear all my scars proudly, for they are the most concrete proof for all the tales that I tell. In fact, I received my first set of scars in the dumbest way possible. One young family out enjoying the vast coastal waterline that Florida bears were chasing their dog that had run off after a low-flying bird. In between their dog taking off and them catching it, their 4-year-old little boy had wandered off. The family, distraught, assumed he was kidnapped or worse, wandered into the low-lying swampland near the beach park. You'll begin to notice a pattern here. They called the authorities, and the authorities didn't do a damn thing worth nothing, so they called me in. It was the middle of the summer, so I didn't bother putting on my leather jacket, believing anything that I'd find in the swamp would be much less dangerous than heat stroke. I picked up on the kid's trail very quickly, but after about 10 minutes, it cut off at the entrance of the pond. I searched all around and I couldn't find anywhere else that the kid could have gone, and I began to assume that he had wandered into the water. And this theory was smashed by the fact that the pond was only about 6 inches deep. When I tried to parse where this child could have gone, I began to hear a very low growl, and that grew in intensity with every other second. Very, very slowly, I turned to face what I believed to be a bobcat at first. This thing didn't resemble anything remotely earthly. Its fur was slick with congealed blood and his teeth were much too long, and there were way too goddamn many of them. I moved for my sword, but this thing pounced at me, and I barely had my arms up to shield my neck. Searing needles of white-hot pain sunk into my forearm as this thing deflected off of me and ran yowling into the forest. The wound itself wasn't anything major, but in the swamp, things become infected terribly fast. I had to retreat. Regardless, they did find the kid. They discovered him about a week later, no worse for wear, coming out of the other side of the swamp about a mile and a half north of where his tracks had stopped. You'll notice here that the end of the story bears a distinct resemblance to some of the reports of a certain search and rescue officer. Indeed, I can attest to the weirdness that poor person had experienced in their job, especially concerning this next tale. Have you ever been hit with an arrow before? Of course not, most reasonable people haven't. Let me tell you, it's not like a video game. During the 4th of July about 3 years ago, a park ranger friend calls me to a local memorial park, saying that there is a bunch of drunk pricks firing off rockets and other fireworks in the center of the woods there. All of her coworkers were off for the holiday, but she had wanted the extra hours, and such was all alone. I slipped on my jacket and swords and I met her at the entrance of the park, and let me tell you, those drunkards were not hard to find at all. As is the usual case in Florida, they were all talk, but at the first sign of a fight, and they backed right off. My friend and I walked around their campsite for a little while longer, just to make sure they hadn't already started any fires or left behind any glass or other garbage. I'm just about to holler for us to leave when I'm suddenly on my back, pain radiating from a stick jutting out of my left shoulder. I struggled to my feet and I looked around to see what the hell was going on, when something else flies past, barely missing my ear. I shine my light at the trees and I shout for my friend, but she's already dashing in my direction, grabbing at my uninjured hand and pulling me behind her. We got to the road that ran through the park and she sat on the ground to catch her breath. My adrenaline had begun to die off, and the missile in my shoulder was starting to pulse agony through my entire left side. I gave it a preemptive yank, but it was jammed in there. When we got back to her headquarters, we ended up having to widen the wound where the arrow had entered, in order to pull it out without causing any further damage. It was a shard of volcanic glass, strapped expertly to a hardwood shaft and fletched with crow's feathers. The shaft was carved all the way across with strange symbols. My friend had no explanation for me. She only mentioned that this isn't the first time she'd seen it. I don't know what had happened there, or how whoever had shot me obtained obsidian in the least volcanic place in the United States. I left for home that night, a new wound in my arm and a hole in my leather jacket to patch. I decided that wearing proper armor would be prudent after what had happened. And since I was still relatively broke, I settled on building my own chain and scale armor. The first piece that I ever designed was a wing scale mob pauldron that fit over my shoulder, neatly covering my armpit and a small part of my chest. I mentioned in my last entry that I'd talk about that goddamn hunger that I had felt. It's no stretch to say that I studied each and every day. Doing this job meant I had to know all the legends about our world, from the lowest Bargus to the mightiest werewolf. I had to know what had happened where I hunted. I had to know what kind of monsters might prove to me that they exist. And so far, I can report that the Native Americans who had inhabited this land long before we did were completely sober when they spoke of their legends. Let me expound upon the concept of the wendigo, and why I hated it so much. To summarize, a wendigo is a monster that is always hungry, and can implant a cannibalistic frenzy into others, forcing them to consume their friends and family, even when food is readily available. This behavior has become so common in our history, there's even a term for its psychology: the wendigo psychosis. Soon after my arrow wound had healed, I was back in the field, investigating some reports on howling at night near a richer neighborhood, close to where a man had gone missing. I didn't believe at the time that the two events were correlated. We don't have wolves down here in Florida. Well, we do, but they're so scattered and rare that we might as well not. As for coyotes, they're not stupid enough to howl and give off their position for bigger things to find them. So what could be howling? And why is it happening so close to an incredibly wealthy community? I moved quietly through the woods, relying on my hearing to take me closer and closer to the sound of the howling. About an hour into the hike, I finally came across a man in a small clearing, sitting in the fetal position in front of what looked to be a deer carcass. The man was naked entirely, and by the movements of his back, he was hyperventilating. I was about to take a step closer, when he suddenly leaned his head straight into the air and let out a howl identical to the ones I had been hearing. I didn't want to take any chances, so I quietly drew my steel blade from my back. I spoke concisely but deeply. "Sir?" He whirled around to face me, and in the moonlight, I could see that this was no longer a man. His eyes had taken on a milky pallor, and it seemed like the irises had almost doubled in size, taking up the entirety of his eyeballs. His teeth were broken and some were jutting out of his jaw, and his cheeks had begun to tear along their sides. His jaw dropped low and he let out a garbled string of near demonic gibberish, spreading out an arm tipped and broken bone fingers. I didn't hesitate to lunge forward with my sword and lay 2 swift strikes into the thing, shouting as I fed my knee into the surprised bastard's forehead and knocking him back. Clearly I was too much for this thing to fight all at once, so he turned tail and began to sprint into the woods. He ran like a man, but it was wrong somehow. Like his legs weren't arranged properly. I bolted after him. I lost sight of him when he entered the tree line, the black shadows of the forest blocking out that natural moonlight. I fumbled to pull the flashlight out of my pocket and flick it on, still running in his general direction. This turned out to be a mistake. I felt my lead foot fly through the air as I tumbled over the lip of a small dirt shelf, plunging a good 30 feet deep into a limestone sinkhole. I felt my ankle snap out of place as I landed, barely managing to tuck myself into a roll. Thankfully, I had instinctively dropped my sword mid-fall so I wouldn't impale myself. The world span and I tried to shake it off as best as I could, fumbling in the blackness for my sword, and slide back on my good leg to try and face my back against a wall. My heart hammered against my ribcage as I tried to stifle my moans of agony. And that's when the hunger started. And just as before, it was an all-consuming state of being, a constant static trying to take over all conscious thought. But I was aware now. My mind was focused on my broken ankle, that I was stuck in a hole with possibly no way out, that there was some sick freak out in the forest that was perfectly willing to come up and eat my guts. Unlike before, the overwhelming lust for meat couldn't take the reins. It whispered in my mind, "Your foot is finished. It's just meat now. You've got a sword, just take it off. It won't hurt. It'll be worth it. You can eat. Don't you want to eat?" I was in that hole until morning had arrived. My conscious mind constantly shifting between wrestling that presence and keeping my guard up in case Milky Eyes decided to show his ugly face again, all the while trying to not scream in agony. But as soon as the sun crested the tree line, everything seemed to stop. I was aware of the birds, the crickets, the shallow puddles all around me. I was also aware that I had a phone with internet service, and if I wasn't an idiot, I could have had someone come help me out of this mess hours ago. I defend myself by saying that I couldn't let my guard down and call 911. That's all now, folks. Sorry if I don't upload often. Florida is as weird as always and I'm always working, so it's hard to get on here to talk about the crazy stuff that happens down here. Be safe.